Great. Welcome, everybody, to tonight's workshop. This is our final Clearing the Air workshop of the year. And so we're really pleased to be able to end on such an important topic here in Louisville, but really across the nation and across the world, environmental justice. We're excited to be able to focus in on some successes that we've seen here in Louisville, and also some continuing work that will be undergoing for many years to come. So just get us started here. Note that all of our attendee lines are muted, and I'm going to go ahead and I'll mute the speaker lines as well. And then when you want to speak, panelists, please just feel free to unmute yourself. We'll just do that for the sake of background noise. So just to start with, a few tips about viewing the webinar. We have some controls across the bottom that allow you to open the chat box function. There's also a Q&A function. And if you want to use that chat feature, you'll be able to submit questions. This is a WebEx event, so we don't have the unmute option available for folks, but when we get into discussion, we can, especially with a small group like this, we can definitely get to that point. If you're only connected by telephone, and I don't see any of those connections here with us this evening, but you can always email questions to clearingtheair@louisvilleky.gov. And you can email questions even if you're not viewing this live. That is a monitored email inbox at APCD, and we'd love to be able to answer questions after the fact at any point that viewers have want some follow-up information. So in general, our Clearing the Air workshop series is something that we undertook 3 years ago at the district because we wanted to help improve our community's understanding of APCD's role in Louisville's air quality and how that improves over time. That was important for us because understanding APCD's role also gives us opportunities to work with our community within those frameworks. We want to be able to empower our community with accessible information. Air quality data is there's a vast amount of it, and a lot of the work that we do at the district is very technical and heavy in regulatory language. So this is an opportunity for us to make that more accessible in an informal setting where we can have a dialogue and a discussion. And also all of that leads to us building relationships. And we've seen some great relationships formed through the course of this workshop series where we've been able to go out external groups and provide additional information and opportunities like this. So here are our ground rules. Most important, there's no silly questions. So if you have a question, we really want to hear it. This is what we're here for. So there's nothing too silly or simple to ask because those are the places that we can start learning together. Also, throughout the presentation slides, you'll see a sunshine with the letters PP in the middle, and that's public participation. And that's something that we really want to highlight throughout the course of this workshop series, no matter the topic. We really want people to find as many spots that they can enter into the conversation, be that a regulatory conversation, a project development or program conversation. We wanted to highlight that throughout. So that's what you'll see that ray of sunshine for. And then again, ask your questions as they come to mind. Feel free to put those in the chat box or email us. And if you have other ideas for this workshop series, please send those our way. We're always looking for new topics or areas that maybe we need to address more fully in the future. And we hope to continue doing these workshops for many, many turns to come. So with that, we'll get started into today's topic. We'll have several different presenters over the course, so and then we'll have each person can take a time to introduce themselves, but I'll just give you a quick rundown of who we have on our panel today. I'm Michelle King. I am the Director of Program Planning at the Air Pollution Control District, and I get to work with a team of folks that do things like put together this workshop series. We also have Rachel Hamilton. She's our Assistant Director at the Air Pollution Control District, and she's responsible for many of the regulatory programs and the air monitoring programs that we'll be talking about today. We have Byron Gary. He's our regulatory coordinator at the district and is also a bit of a data guru for us. So he'll be talking through some of our presentation of data to help us understand where we've been with environmental justice with regard to air pollution and kind of what our current state is. And last but absolutely not least, we have Arnita Gadsden with us here today. And Arnita is the Executive Director of the West Jefferson County Community Task Force, which is a central role in the story of the STAR program and of environmental justice in Louisville. So we're really pleased that Arnita was able to join us, and we'll be able to help provide some perspective from the community group's work, and hopefully we'll have some questions to discuss at the end. So thank you all, and we're gonna get started. Get my screen going. So here's a little roadmap of where we're going. First, we're going to do just a quick overview of environmental justice and air toxics. We'll talk about some definitions and some programs that will be helpful to keep in mind as we go forward. But first of all, what is environmental justice? This is kind of a foundation to everything we're talking about tonight. This on your screen right now is the framework the Environmental Protection Agency has laid out, and it's one that APCD has really looked to in applying environmental justice framework to our own work. And that really starts out with the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, the implementation, and the enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that sets a really big goal right there, that fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And they go on at the EPA to lay out what I think are some benchmarks for us to look at to figure out, have we achieved that goal of fair treatment and meaningful involvement? So that is achieved, they say, when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. So how we measure those benchmarks is something that we really need to be able to talk about as a community. How do we come together to figure out, is everyone enjoying that same degree of protection? And does everyone have equal access to that decision-making process? So there is a lot to discuss when it comes to taking a look at those benchmarks. And we just really need to recognize, too, that this is one way to look at and define environmental justice, and there's many other aspects to consider, and a lot of folks in our community and across the nation would have a lot to add to this definition. So this is really a starting point, but it's important for us to have a jumping off point to continue discussing environmental justice. And why is that important? Well, we need to recognize areas in our city where there are environmental injustices occurring, because we need to be able to address issues that are related to things like public health equity, social and economic justice, and environmental harm. These things often add up and accumulate to disproportionately overburden certain parts of our community in Louisville. These are often, it's not one of these injustices or another that are impacting these communities, but rather they're layered on top of each other. So it's important for us to recognize that environmental justice aspect and work to alleviate those conditions. We need to continue fostering collaborations that will raise awareness around environmental justice. So remember that part about access to decision making. We need to, as a district, we recognize we need to go into communities that have environmental justice concerns, and we need to hear those concerns. We need to hear those ideas about how we can address those concerns. And I think that the story of the STAR program development is a good example of how you can have a lot of success when you have a community that is so empowered and willing to come to the table with regulators that are willing to hear that community and then go from there together to create something that is a really powerful tool for our city. We want to promote that public participation in community decision making, and that's another part of having access to the process. And all of that's really going to build communities where all people can achieve their full potential. So environmental justice is really an underpinning of all of those things. So when we talk about environmental justice in Louisville, we really are talking a lot about the story of Rubbertown. That's not by any means the only example of environmental injustice in Louisville, but it's absolutely probably top of mind for many people, especially if you live in the West Louisville area. So just looking at where things started, we can go way back in time. In the west part of our city, in Louisville, of course, the river runs along there, and so as a major transportation corridor, the Standard Oil refinery started out there in 1918. And that really set the stage for industrial growth in that area for many years to come. And then in World War II, that industrial area was key to the production of synthetic rubber for the war effort. So the war had cut off these natural rubber sources, and all of those Jeeps and airplanes and tanks for the war needed this synthetic rubber. Louisville had many of the components needed, including waste products from our bourbon industry, like ethanol, but we also had the other key ingredients right there in the West Louisville industrial area, and of course the river for transportation. That area is now what we call Rubbertown, and that's the genesis of that name. But this is just a small piece of the picture of what is currently Rubbertown. There's many other practices such as redlining in Louisville that have led to what our community looks like today, and where our residential areas are and where our industrial areas are, and where those often are conflicting. So this is what we look like today in Rubbertown. That's that large synthetic plant is now broken up into several, still quite large facilities. There's about a dozen of what we call Title V's. Those are the largest facilities that we permit by type, but there's a half again as many of the next type of permitted facility down, which are also still significant industrial sources. There's chemical, rubber manufacturing, there are fuel terminals, and there's the county's largest wastewater treatment plant, all in this small area of our city. In addition to all of that, and because of all of that, there's also a great deal of rail and highway transportation traffic there, as well as served by barge, and then there's the historic contamination and closed dumps from that legacy of industrial activity there. So this is a really concentrated area of industry and of emissions that really, for decades, led to a lot of concern in the community about what are the health impacts of all these activities. And in particular, what are the health impacts of what we're breathing from Rubbertown? So that's where we kind of come closer to our current day story. And in 1996, the West Jefferson County Community Task Force was formed. And the formation was really driven by this community concern and this recognition that there needed to be a hub for these issues to be addressed around. So that initial members of the task force included citizens from 12 West Jefferson County neighborhoods, from some of the Rubbertown industries, the University of Louisville, the Metropolitan Sewer District, Air Pollution Control District, and the Health Department, as well as EPA Region 4. So they really pulled together a lot of resources all in one table with the development of the task force. And I just wanted to read out the mission of the task force right now, because I think it really speaks to what the concerns of the community were at that time. And that's the mission of the West Jefferson County Community Task Force is to provide research and studies to validate or nullify environmental concerns and issues of residents of West Jefferson County to empower residents to make informed decisions. And their goals when they were established were to identify environmental concerns and environmental health concerns of the residents of West Louisville and Western Jefferson County, to prioritize and communicate those concerns, to develop recommendations and strategies to address them, and this is key, to ensure the implementation of these so that all parties contribute appropriately as good neighbors to the well-being of the community. And I read that all out because I think that if you could sum up the story of the STAR program, those statements would really be kind of the headline there. So I think it's really important to recognize how this group was able to come together, the steps that they were able to take, and the resources that brought to bear. Everything from funding from federal agencies like EPA. State Senator Gerald Neal was able to fund the West Louisville air toxic study and the follow-up to the West Louisville air toxic study for many years from state funds. So this brought a lot of power together to address problems. And I think that that's important for us to remember today when we're looking for solutions to today's concerns and the problems that our community is struggling with to deal with today, is looking at models like this that have led to successes today. So in the early 2000s, there were health assessments conducted in the Rubbertown neighborhoods. Those found a greater risk of cancer and illness to Rubbertown residents compared to other areas of Louisville, which was not a surprise to the folks that lived there and had been raising these alarms for many years. And then further, an air monitoring study was able to identify 17 carcinogens with a risk that was greater than 1 in a million. So what are those air toxics? And this is where we're going to jump out of the timeline in the story to get some definitions and familiarize ourselves with a few of our resources. So air toxics are also known as hazardous air pollutants. That's often how they're discussed within federal programs. And those are pollutants that are known or suspected to cause cancer or other very serious health effects. And these are emitted from a variety of sources. We are talking a lot today about what we refer to as point sources, or those large permitted facilities. Think of that as being a point on a map, and that's where those emissions are coming from. They don't move around, but they're big enough to see on a map. That's how I remember point sources. Area sources also stay in one place, but they're typically a little smaller than what we refer to as point sources, but there's often many of them, and they can add up together to a lot of emissions. So we're talking about everything from factories and power plants to gas stations, dry cleaners. Even paints and solvents and consumer products in our own homes can contribute air toxics. There's also mobile sources, and these are really important. We have to recognize the risk that's being added in by cars, trucks, and trains. Those sources of hazardous air pollutants individually are not maybe as large as a large facility, but cumulatively can actually add risk greater than what we see from some of these larger facilities. And that's an important place for us to continue looking today for the next type of health improvement. So we also have natural sources. Thankfully, we don't deal with a lot of natural sources here in Louisville, although forest fires can bring air toxics from many, many miles away. So it is an important source to recognize. And here's some of the just range of health effects that air toxics bring. That's everything from cancer development to reproductive problems and respiratory disease, of course, but also cardiovascular impact. So we can see that air toxics don't cause one problem and they don't come from one place. So we need a big program to find solutions for these. I referred earlier to the West Louisville air toxic study, and this is a really important because it's foundational for much of the STAR program. So it was a one-year monitoring study. Community went out and helped design where locations of these monitoring sites would be and collect the actual air monitoring samples that were then taken back to a lab. And the data then from all of that 1 year of air monitoring was then put into a risk assessment by a contractor that the community selected. Again, the voice of the community was so important in this and really integral to the success of the program because it was built on their own work. So some of the things that were monitored for, you can see is a large variety of substances, but the key results were that there were 17 carcinogens with a risk of greater than 1 in a million that were identified out of that study that were actually monitored in the air. So that 17 number is key, and you'll see that again as we go through the presentation. EPA around that time also released a relative risk screening assessment that just added further fuel to the fire here locally, that we were seen to be assessed as the #1 county of 8 southeastern states. Those are listed there as far as risk of exposure to toxic air pollutants. So that really, I think, drove a lot of the will. If there were holdouts at that point, this was really important. We had to do something here in Louisville. One of the other places that we look for data is the Toxics Release Inventory Program that was created under the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act. And it requires companies that meet certain criteria to report annually their emissions of toxics. And not just their steady state normal operations, but if they have excess emissions, so releases, accidents, those all have to be reported through this one PRI program. And that puts all that data in one place that we can then use for things like the National Air Toxics Assessment, or NATA. And this is modeling that is done periodically by EPA of all the outdoor or ambient air toxics from all sources. And they've done this in 2005, 11, and 14. And really, it's a screening tool to help zero in on areas where there are larger risks from air toxics and where additional work might need to be done. But we've also been able to take a look at this over time and look for trends in risk from air toxics. So right now, we just want to go to one of the pictures that we can paint with that NATA tool. This shows what on the left side of your screen, the blue map shows census data for, in 2000, the percent minority. So the darker areas of that map are a higher percentage of minority population across our city. So that kind of sees where people are living, particularly where our minorities in our community are living. And as you can see, it's not an equal distribution across our county. Compare that then with the air toxics risk in 2005 from all sources of pollution. So this includes those point, area, and mobile sources. And what you can see is that there's a really obvious correlation with where the majority of our minority population resides in Louisville and where the greatest air toxics risk. But again, the STAR program is looking at point sources or those stationary facilities. So what about if we just look at that? And I think that this map makes it even clearer, the discrepancy in air toxics from where industrial facilities are sited in our community and where our minority population resides. So this is the picture of environmental injustice that we saw in 2005, and that was before the implementation of the STAR program. So now that we're up to that point, you've got all the background you need, and we're ready to dive right into what is this STAR program so that we can learn a little more about what was developed and then go from there to see what were the results. So I'm going to hand this off to Rachel Hamilton, our Assistant Director.
Thank you, Michelle. And I am very pleased to be able to tell the story of what happened next. So we had this large citizen-led West Louisville air toxic study. And out of that really came a tremendously unique local-only air toxics regulatory program. Next slide. I thought you froze there for a minute, Michelle. Sorry. So you've probably heard me talk about this before, but the Clean Air Act is really a remarkable continuous improvement program. You know, in 1970, Congress initially asked for regulatory agencies like APCD to focus on criteria pollutants, and there are 6 of those. That's carbon dioxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxides, I'm sorry, those are nitrogen oxides, ozone, and particulate matter. And local agencies and state agencies were very effective working with US EPA to drive down those criteria pollutants. And in 1990, Congress came back to the Clean Air Act and said, all right, that process of continually strengthening the national ambient air quality standards for those criteria pollutants based on the most recent scientific data is working well. Now we're going to ask EPA to do the same type of process for air toxics. Unfortunately, it took a while longer than either EPA or Congress expected. they were to have a program in place and effective by 1998. But even in 2013, they were finishing up what is actually a two-part process, where they go through and evaluate certain sources from a technical standpoint. It's a technology-based standard, and then come back to determine whether the risk that remains once the best technology is implemented is acceptable. And then, just like with the criteria pollutants, EPA is required to come back every 8 years and reevaluate whether that risk-based standard remains protective of human health and the environment, or if it needs to be strengthened. Next slide, please. The START program came into being right about the time that EPA was struggling to complete their air toxics regulatory work. And STAR is a regulatory program to reduce harmful contaminants in the air that all of us breathe, to better protect the health of citizens here in Louisville and enhance the quality of life. You know, at its core, this is a community-led initiative and one that's paid off very well, in particular around air toxics, their impact on health, and what should be done to address those issues. Next slide, please. So this is the timeline for the Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Program. You'll see, as Michelle mentioned, that West Jefferson County Community Task Force was formed in 1996, and by 2000, they had all the pieces in place to begin that West Louisville air toxics study. Once that information was assessed, both from a carcinogenic risk standpoint and a non-carcinogenic risk standpoint, the district took that information and developed the first draft of the STAR program in 2004. This was a large community-involved project. There were over 60 meetings, 1,300 people in attendance. At the end of that process, again, this is a public participation process, the district had a 200-plus page response to comment document just on the first draft. By January of 2005, they had taken those comments and developed the second draft. That was the final draft, and the district has a 350-page response to comment document. In numerous meetings with the Air Pollution Control Board, who is APCD's regulatory partner. In 2005, they adopted the Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Program. Since then, the program is being implemented. It's trite to say it, but true. For those of us at the district, STAR is a do, not a did. It's not a one-time analysis. It's a frequent analysis, both from a permitting standpoint, when we look at both existing processes and companies, and new companies. We check when they submit their record keeping, reporting, and monitoring to us to determine compliance with the STAR program. I think that's my final point on that. You know, before, as I mentioned, before the adoption of the STAR program, there were multiple community meetings. This was a really involved process, and leaders from all over, both from the community side, the industrial side, and also the administration side. The district really dove into this work. We had monthly presentations to EPA, multiple meetings with industry, local agencies, community groups, and citizens in Rubbertown. And at the end, they really built consensus on what was the problem and what needed to be done. Out of that, our regulatory program is on our website, and it includes numerous opportunities for public comment. This is, you know, at its core, STAR is a framework for determining the environmental acceptability of air toxics, both from a carcinogenic standpoint and a non-carcinogenic standpoint. It requires companies to assess and address their air toxics emissions, and it required APCD to assess and address other sources of toxic emissions. You know, in short, companies are required to tell us where their emissions come from physically, what they emit and how much. They're required to use very sophisticated US EPA models. If they exceed the environmental acceptability goals, they're required to take a reduction. And then, of course, they have to show compliance. And by comparison, generally speaking, in US EPA's agrotoxics program, a risk level that's less than 100 in a million at the census tract centroid is an acceptable risk. With STAR, we're really looking at fence lines. The risk is 1 in a million for a single toxic air contaminant at a single process. For existing facilities, it's 7.5 in a million, and new facilities or new processes at an existing company, it's 3.8 in a million. So we're much more stringent than the federal program. Next slide. As part of the program, APCD really relies on a wealth of authorities, both from the toxicological side and also on that risk assessment side. And that allows us to establish a risk level for each chemical, both carcinogenic risk and non-carcinogenic risk. We form something called the benchmark ambient concentration, and we publish those values. They're actually in micrograms per cubic meter. That's a concentration that you can breathe on our website. And from a permitting standpoint, like I said, we use EPA approved dispersion models. That information tells us whether or not a company's emitted potential meets the benchmark ambient concentration, which is generally a risk of 1 in a million for carcinogens and a hazard quotient of 1 for non-carcinogens. Once we understand what their emissions are, there'll be a permit limit. And then our engineers and our permitting program will develop sufficient record keeping, reporting, and monitoring to be able to evaluate that emission against that limit. Next slide. So Michelle mentioned that those 17 toxic air contaminants that exceeded a risk of 1 in a million are important. And she's right. Those are called Category 1 TACs. Those are ones that we knew were causing a problem with the West Louisville air toxic study. And so we wanted to be sure that we resolved the issue of concern there. The Category 2 toxic air contaminants were actually those toxic air contaminants with a risk over 500 in EPA's risk study. And then the Category 3 and 4, those are just the rest of the 188 hazardous air pollutants. So we're looking at 188 hazardous air pollutants, but STAR is much broader than that. It actually covers any toxic air contaminant that falls within the general duty clause, and it covers any source that may fall within that same general duty clause. And at its core, it's really just that no chemical, no source should cause a risk greater than the regulatory program. It's the larger sources that we're required to make a demonstration right off the bat. That's our Title V sources. Those are our really large sources. You're familiar with Ford Motor Company, American Synthetic Rubber Company, LG&E. Those are examples of Title V sources. And then we have a group of synthetic minors. These are companies that are big enough to be a Title V company, but take a limit to stay below that threshold. And again, the general duty allows for review of any source and any TAC or any new TAC. Next slide. So after the adoption of the STAR program, if I step back just a second, when we work with US EPA on a national program, we get the benefit of EPA guidance as the program is rolled out. We get the benefit of best practices from our partners across the nation implementing the same program. STAR is a little bit different. This is the only strategic toxic air reduction program like this in the nation. And so after the adoption of the STAR program, several stakeholder groups were formed. The STAR Implementation Advisory Group that worked between 2005 and 2007. And as it says, they reviewed the nuts and bolts of the newly implemented program. How would this integrate into the existing program? Where would it go into permits? And a few other lingering questions for the regulatory process. And then there's the STAR Regulation 530 Stakeholder Group. They developed and reviewed and commented on, produced a report assessing the risk to human health and welfare, and a plan of action to reduce risk from smaller sources emitting toxic emissions throughout the community. As Michelle mentioned, the large plants are not the only source of toxic air contaminants in our community. Both of these processes had public notice and comment periods. Also, additional air monitoring data from the Reg 530 stakeholder group looking at those smaller sources. That report is still available on APCD's website under stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. And I'll turn this over to my colleague, Byron Gary.
Thanks, everybody. Michelle introduced me. I'm Byron Gary, the regulatory coordinator for APCD. My main responsibilities are reviewing our regs and our state implementation plan to make sure that our regs are up to date, that they are meeting the needs of our engineering team, and that our state implementation plan is keeping us in compliance with the National Clean Air Act. But in reviewing regs, I've sort of picked up some data analysis, which is what I'm going to go through a little bit here, just to overview how we keep track of how we're doing with the STAR program. The first part of this is, as Rachel always says, STAR is a do, not a did. Companies submit emissions inventories to us, and we have an engineering team. Each plant has an assigned engineer who reviews those to make sure that they are in compliance with the limits in their permit and all of those sort of other things. But to get more of a large picture overview, I've picked up some data from a couple of EPA sources. And that first data source that I've looked at a bunch is the toxics release inventory that Michelle described earlier. There are some limitations to this. The TRI does not capture every single chemical that is covered by the STAR program, but it's a nice, easy way to compare data over a really long span of years. As you can see here, emissions across the board of all toxic air contaminants that are captured by TRI have reduced by about half since 2005, since the STAR program was adopted by the board. In particular, you can see chemical manufacturing took a nosedive since that time as far as their emissions. There are still certainly some areas that we need to pay attention to, but we do continue to monitor this every year. Next slide. And those category 1 tax that Michelle and Rachel have both talked about, the ones that we found with the West Louisville air toxic study were posing the most danger to West Louisville. Those in particular, we have seen a huge reduction in emissions from almost 900,000 pounds in 2000 to down around under 10,000 typically in a given year in 2019. And that's from all sources in Louisville. And those category 1 tax are all reported in the TRI. So this does capture all of them. Next slide. Typically, we don't like comparisons at the district to other areas because the goal isn't really to beat Houston or Portland or whoever. It's to make sure that our air is the healthiest it can be for our citizens. But in reviewing the TRI data, I did take a look at these emissions from across the country, grouped by county. And I did this not because we need to be better than Portland, but to see whether the results were unique to Louisville. Did we accomplish something with STAR more than the national decline anyway? As you can see, Harris, Texas, which is Houston, has cut almost 1 million pounds in releases as well. But that said, we did go from 11th in the nation for those category 1 tax to 160th. So this wasn't just the decline over time as industry improves emissions and the ratcheting down from the Clean Air Act and the other programs that Rachel described. We actually did see a significant decrease that is directly attributable, we feel, to the STAR program. Next slide. And that's really resulted in demonstrable health benefits for our community. The National Air Toxics Assessment that Michelle described earlier, on the left you see 2005 emissions, not emissions, actual cancer risk from those emissions from point sources. And that scale's a little hard to read, but in that West Louisville area, that risk was as high as 355 in a million from point sources alone in 2005. And now, those two darkest areas that you see, the one in West Louisville and the one in the Newburgh area, those are right about 10 in a million. So across the county, but especially in West Louisville, we have seen huge reductions. I should also point out with regards to the 2014 data, we acknowledge this, as Michelle said, is a screening tool only. And in looking at this and evaluating those hotspots, we think that those emissions may have been overstated in the inventory that was used to do the modeling. In particular, that spot around Newburgh, we found a small company that was reporting the amounts of a chemical called chromium that they use rather than the amount that they actually emit. So we hope that some of that chromium actually did make it into the product that they were selling and not all out into the air, and we're rather confident that one in particular is significantly lower than it actually is. That's a whirlwind view of sort of the EPA resources that we use to continue to keep an eye on that 50,000-foot view level of our progress in Louisville. And certainly, as you can see, West Louisville still has a greater risk than the rest of Louisville. So this isn't a story that's over by any means. Definitely still progress to be made. I think I kick it back to you, Michelle.
I'm actually going to kick it over to Rachel. Talk to us a little bit more, Rachel, about some of the work that's underway. Sorry, I clicked back and forth too many times. And feel free to talk to me, Rachel, as you'd like.
Okay. Just want to be sure you're picking up at slide 42.
I will.
Thank you. So just as Byron said, the purpose of our presentation is not to show that our work is done, but it's really to look at where we need to go next. We've made progress, we recognize that, but there is a lot of work to be done. So next slide, please. So in Rubbertown, APCD operates the Algonquin Parkway Air Monitoring Network site, and that is a multi-purpose monitor. We monitor for criteria pollutants that include particulate matter and sulfur dioxide. We also have very sophisticated meteorological equipment there because we want to know where the air is coming from, where the wind is blowing from, what direction it's blowing to, because we know we have a population there that may be exposed. And in fact, the Algonquin Parkway site is a neighborhood scale air monitoring site. So this is really focusing on not just the facilities, but the people who are there and who breathe the air around our air monitoring site. This information is from our 2020 Kentucky Annual Ambient Air Monitoring Network Plan. It is a public document. It's published once a year. Tells you what sites monitor what and how often. And one unique feature of this site is that we're also monitoring volatile organic compounds here using an auto gas chromatograph. Next slide, please. So the volatile organic compounds that we're monitoring, many are air toxics. The reason that we're monitoring them here at our Algonquin Parkway site is this was the site of maximum impact during the West Louisville air toxic study. So we have a great deal of data looking at air toxics in this area. We wanted to be able to provide air monitoring data to continue that analysis in the future. Next slide, please. So what are we monitoring there? What you'll see, as we've mentioned before, many of these toxic air contaminants are Category 1 tags from the West Louisville air toxic study. Those chemicals that were of primary concern during the West Louisville air toxic study, we want to see where we're at with those now at this point in time since the implementation of the STAR program. You'll also notice that there are a couple that are Category 2 tags and Category 4 tags under the STAR program. We've included those volatile organic compounds here because they have high photochemical reactivity. And so we believe that they may be very important in the formation of ozone. And later this year, we'll be installing similar auto gas chromatograph equipment at our Cannons Lane air monitoring site It's more of an urban air monitoring site in order to determine what emissions in a speciated way are driving the formation of ozone layer in Louisville. Next slide, please. For those of you who haven't visited our website, we have an updated Louisville AirWatch 2.0, and we really invite you to look at that site and to bookmark it so that you can check out the air quality on a very frequent basis. You'll find improved access to current air monitoring, and also some air toxics are being reported in real time, specifically benzene, cyclohexane, and toluene. And those are chemicals where our auto GC has high data validity. We will begin reporting some additional air toxics on a monthly basis through our board reports, but we've determined that those air toxics take a little bit more post-processing quality assurance in order to determine their validity. So I hope that you will go to the Mobile AirWatch website, explore it. It has a great lookup function so that you can compare data from previous days. That's a really nice new feature. Michelle? Just briefly get to this. Oh, to keep us on track here. For many, you may be familiar with EPA's Regionally Applied Research Effort Project, which began in earnest in about 2018 with the field deployment of some next generation emissions measurement equipment. That project has been going on, and US EPA has analyzed data. It is available on our website. They are still analyzing data. And as that information becomes available, we will be posting it to our website as well. I'm not sure that any of us knew exactly how this project would play out when we heard that EPA was interested in helping us to understand fugitive emission sources in Rubbertown as part of our strategic toxic air reduction program to better understand how those emissions might be impacting public health. But since they've been here, the project has spun off into a great deal of additional research areas, including a odor app. And you'll be hearing more from us and from US EPA as the citizen science part of that project takes off in the next couple of months. And also an odor volatile organic emissions tracking system that we believe will help us better identify odors and the sources of odors by using some crowdsourced, specifically placed canisters throughout the community. That project is in the testing phase, and we'll be providing updates on it in the future. Michelle?
Great. Thank you, Rachel. I will pick up again right here. If this were a map, it would say you are here, because you are here. And this Clearing the Air workshop series, as I said earlier, one of the key elements here is that we wanted to provide opportunity to educate and further empower Louisville residents with air quality and process information, both. And so this was just a way for us to create a forum to do that. It's by no means the only forum in which we hope to be able to provide that kind of information and access to our community, but it was, we felt like a missing piece to have something that's just really focused on the education and sharing of information and answering questions, just making district information and staff more accessible. So that's what we're here today to do. In addition to these kinds of workshops, we've also been able to do trainings twice now through using hands-on computer lab resources. We weren't able to do that this year, but hope to come back and bring that kind of hands-on training back into the workshop series next year. But we've really focused on where people can find and use local data resources. So that may be anything from APCD air monitoring data to traffic data from our local metropolitan planning organization to data on land use and mapping from the Louisville Jefferson County Information Consortium, or LOGIC. So those are a few of the local resources, but we've also had EPA staff come to town and do trainings on the toxics release inventory and NADA and some other modeling tools. So again, we just kind of want to put these tools into our community's hands and then see what comes next. We've also just this year finished up a multipollutant stakeholder group, and multipollutant in that we know that we have certain challenges really at the top of our air quality list, like ozone. We are not attaining the national health-based standard for ozone right now as a community. We've been improving, and we're close, but we're not there. We need new strategies. But we know while we're looking at ozone, we want to find strategies that also help us continue to reduce air toxics and continue to reduce exposure to residents. Sometimes those can be different strategies, and we want all of those tools in our toolbox. So we convened a multi-pollutant stakeholder group. They met over the course of several months and broke out into committees to discuss different types of emissions and different types of strategies. This slide, if you look back at it later after this presentation and download this PDF, you'll see that this report is a hyperlink. The emissions inventory dashboard symbol there is a hyperlink, and that's something else that Byron was able to build out for us. And this takes emissions inventory data for our entire metropolitan area, so not just Jefferson County, but all the surrounding counties as well. And you can look at that in at different levels over time. For 2011, 2014, and even 2017 is available there. So again, we're just trying to make sure that we find ways to get this information, this data that's out there, put it in a more user-friendly format and help people find it. Because that's where we really can have next level conversations to do things like lead to the STAR program. So a few of the recommendations that came out of that process, there were more than 90 of them, so we won't go over on very many, but I wanted to highlight a few that really spoke to those elements of environmental justice that we started out with. Things like investigating opportunities to enhance our monitoring network. Rachel just talked about the Algonquin Parkway air monitoring site and the new air toxics monitoring that we've been able to implement there. That's a really good example, but also that we would ensure community involvement in the planning for that network. So, you know, we have a lot of regulations that we follow when we put in air monitoring site, but we also need to be listening to concerns from our community, and where they have questions, we have questions as part of our community about air quality. And that's a good example where that concern led to additional air monitoring in that Algonquin Parkway air monitoring site. Some of these recommendations went beyond APCD, and quite frankly, they should, particularly if we're looking at environmental justice. This is not just an air quality issue, and even air quality aspects of environmental justice are not just within the purview of the Air Pollution Control District to affect and improve. So one of those recommendations was that Louisville Metro government should mandate the use and incorporation of environmental and health impacts in planning decisions, such as those guided by the comprehensive plan. And there are conversations right now underway, and we'll give you a little more information about that, about how we are bringing that environmental justice perspective into land use planning and transportation planning conversations. And then lastly, highlight that the stakeholders recommended the district to provide some recommendations for the next health equity report. If you haven't had a chance to view the health equity report that came from the Center for Health Equity out of the health department, I highly recommend it. It is a valuable resource, and it's one that we've really been able to look at and help us kind of better understand where those cumulative impacts of our city and our community are being felt, and to give us another lens to look at air quality and how it impacts our community's health. So again, those are just a sampling of those recommendations. But as I mentioned, many of them do go beyond Air Pollution Control District, and as they should, many areas of metro government are having conversations about environmental justice and really integrating that into their regular work. So, for example, the Office of Sustainability and Advanced Planning I think it's advanced planning and sustainability, but you can tell where my priorities lie, and I put sustainability first. But they have been leading the way in our climate planning, both from a standpoint of emission reductions and how strategies to reduce greenhouse gases, many of which we know also will reduce those other criteria air pollutants like ozone and fine particulates and air toxics that we've been talking about today. So how those emission reduction strategies are implemented can have environmental justice implications, either benefits or the lack of. And so it's something that they are very aware of and planning and implementing those strategies, and very much so in climate adaptation plans. So we know that there are impacts of climate change that are coming, and we can't stop. We're already feeling some of them today. How do we adapt as a community to be ready for those and to make sure that the brunt of those isn't felt strongly by our most vulnerable? We want to make sure that everyone is lifted up when the floodwaters come, and which is only a little bit of an analogy because there actually will be floodwaters coming as one of the anticipated climate impacts here in Louisville. But then there's also calls for environmental justice policy across Louisville metro government. Some of that work is happening in departments like the Air Pollution Control District, which is engaging in a top to bottom review of our work, but also in departments across metro government. And in many conversations, those are seen as a need to have a citywide environmental justice policy. And in fact, that was a strategy that was included in our resilience plan, because environmental justice is essential to having a resilient community. And that means resilient to those physical impacts of climate change, but also the social justice that comes with being a resilient city. We recognize that environmental justice is part of justice throughout our city. So that is an important strategy, and those conversations, like I say, are happening across metro government, but one that we wanted to highlight and close on today to make sure that everyone was aware of is in the land use planning and decision-making process. So the map that you have here, another Byron Gary specialty, thank you, Byron. This really helps us visualize what we're talking about. So again, we have the population map is on the right, and those darker areas in that map are where we see the concentration of our minority population. Again, something we know this about Louisville, that we are not a spread out diverse city, that we have through a lot of different land use and housing decisions over time become a very segregated city. And so what that comes with then is what you see on the left-hand side, and that map shows you zoning types. And in case it's hard to see on your screen, that green, most of all that's all residential single-family housing. And so you can see that there's a lot of residential single-family. There's residential multifamily, which is a blue color, and in the yellow color too, all throughout the west portion of our county. But then you see a lot of orange and purple, and orange is industrial. Purple is what's called EZ1, and it's an enterprise zone. And a lot of industrial activity is by right allowed in that EZ1. And you really see where the concentration of those land uses and the zoning that allows those land uses has also concentrated in the western half of our county. So it also just starts adding up the layers to, okay, well, now we know a little bit about why Rubbertown is there, and where are people living at this point, and do those conflicting land uses next to each other, or is that still being furthered by how we zone our city? And that's something that the planning and design department in Louisville Metro government is looking at actively. Right now, they're undertaking a land development code reform process, and they've had one round of listening sessions so far, and they found that a few topics kept coming up. One of the largest was housing, and they have 2 sessions coming up to talk about housing, but another one was environmental justice. And so there is a session scheduled on December the 12th. It's a Saturday from 10 a.m. and at least a 2-hour session till noon And we will be talking more about environmental justice and land use. And you'll see some of the types of maps that you saw today when we hear from APCD, but we'll also be hearing from the Brownfields coordinator and understanding how brownfields, which are properties that have some historic legacy of contamination from previous land uses, how redevelopment of those is affected by the Land Development Code. And we'll also be hearing from Arnita again during that session, and bringing a community perspective on that. And of course, we'll be hearing from planning and design. So I wanted to make sure to highlight this opportunity because it really is kind of the next step in this conversation for our community, is to look at the Land Development Code and how we can improve upon that. So just as the last little slide, and then I'm hoping that Arnita will have some thoughts to reflect and share with us. This is just what we're trying to focus on to continue the conversation that we've had here at the Air Pollution Control District. So we want to support and create opportunities for meaningful involvement for all people. We want to continue offering transparent and frequent opportunities. So not just here and there, but we want to be out and invite the community to our forums like this, but also go to our community and hopefully be invited in to bring information and hear from our community in their own forums as well. And then we obviously we will continue highlighting public participation, because that is just a hallmark of good environmental regulation, is to make sure you have that diverse voice and representation from the community. And then work collectively with our Metro government peers to raise awareness of environmental justice issues and where those can be found throughout Louisville. So with that, I'll leave you on this slide that just goes to show we can have cleaner air. We can do big things like implement the STAR program, and we can do all of that while having a successful economy. And if we focus on those benefits for all, we all get there better together. So that is always our, kind of our takeaway here, is that we can have a healthy city and have a city that also thrives together. So with that, I'll just point out there's a couple of pages of resources. These are all links here at the end of this presentation. So if you're going back and reviewing this later, explore some more, because there's a lot of really good information here. So with that, I'm going to take us out of this slideshow panel and see if I can stop sharing there. And Arnita, you've been so patient with us today as we just told a whole lot of story, and you were there really on the front line that entire time. And I know you had a lot of different hats you wore through that time, both with the task force and other positions. I'm just wondering if you had some thoughts that you wanted to share and reflections on that, or where we are now.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that the main thing that we have to stay cognizant of is that when we talk about inequity, when we talk about racism, this is all by design. None of us was born like this. We didn't come into the world not liking the scream of the baby beside us because they were of a different color. Everybody screamed because they were hungry, because they wanted change. And it was that those are the needs. And I think we need to go back to realize sometimes that we should be looking at this in the same way. I think that we need to look at how we think about our problem solving. A lot of times our problem solving, we first develop a lot of technical knowledge that when we do that, sometimes then we leave a few people behind, because they don't come back because they figure that's all they're going to hear is the technical knowledge. Then the other thing that we have to realize is that now we need to look at some things. We're always talking about technology, how it has to improve, how we have to But what I think we need to do, and I was looking at this one article, and then I turned around and lost what I was getting ready to read, which is what I do all the time. But then I think we need to look at things like more incentivizing the corporations and consumers where we have a change. Either we can incentivize the corporations to where, it is much more productive for their bottom line improves, or the quality improves, or they don't get as many fines, or they don't get notices of violation. So when we look at some of the things that, that I wrote and I sent them to you all, that, when we look at the existing laws and we review the laws, we need to revise them not only to include mechanical failures and releases, but damages done to the community suffering from the results. And if we look at when people say, well, paying somebody off does not solve the problem. No, it doesn't solve the problem, but it can ease the problem, because now if I want to stay here, now I can retrofit my home to where I don't smell as much, or I have better ventilation, or I have more alternative ways of increasing my energy, or I can move. And that is the main thing that we must realize. And many times people are caught where they are. They cannot go anywhere. So we can talk about, well, okay, we brought the emissions down. That's great. So we're not breathing as badly, or we're not breathing things that hurt us as badly. That's great. But the people cannot get away. So even though we brought it down, is the quality of life for real better? And that is a question that I think we need to ask ourselves at all times. When we ask ourselves that, then we go back to this thing about racism and inequality are by design. So every time we think about redesigning anything, we have to think, is this going to bring a cultural quality or cultural uplift that will help people rise up, and not rise up to get mad at anything, but increase the quality of life. And everybody's quality of life is not always the same. And as we were talking, when we were talking about the design, I was looking at the environmental justice policy out in California. And the more I read, the more confused I became, because they really haven't, what am I trying to say, completed or accomplished that true environmental policy. And environmental policy should be in everything we do, just like we were talking about sightings of where companies are. Not only we're talking about sightings where people are not disproportionately, affected by them, but how are they going to be an active part of the community 20 years from now? And many times the companies come in with the design, with the thought, I'm going to expand. They may not tell you that, but that's the reason why I'm here, is to make more money, is to increase my bottom line. So we have to make sure that in 20 years, they may be able to increase their bottom line, but they better make it to where that no one else is affected. So that means they have to improve their technology, they have to improve their equipment every time they want to increase, or maybe in 20 years, what they were making now has a new way of being processed, so we're using that new way, So many of the things that you have already said, I don't want to go over again, but I think some of the things that we need to think about, we need to look at a repository of historic facilities. We need to find out that perhaps that everything that we're looking at now is not the bad guy, but there are some things that were here long ago that has what I call that long tail of discovery that could still be causing some problems, which I believe we were talking about the other day, that one chemical that I couldn't think of, that we kept finding in our monitoring, that we couldn't figure where it was coming from because nobody used it. anymore at the time of the monitoring. Did we ever find where it was coming from? No, because we were monitoring that day, or every 12 days. So those are things we need to look at. The things that the companies, I think, as far as incentivize, not only incentivizing the companies, of course, we need to incentivize us as consumers. If we cannot afford if I want to get a Tesla, can I afford it? No. You know, if I really want to do something that's going to help me, the environment, all of that, if I can't afford it, if it's something that's not going to come within my realm of support, then there's something wrong with that. Do you see what I'm saying? It's easy for someone to stand and give this whole rendition about solar panels and the whole solar array and what we should do, and then look at your audience, and your audience is sitting there going, okay, is that what, $150? Or is it $30,000? And so those are the things we always, when we're looking at environmental justice, everything has to be considered in that. What we do, how we do, our way of thinking, and then we have to realize that there are several ways of thinking to get things done. And all of us have, when we did our aptitude test, some of them were more of the scientific, more of the concrete, more of the philosophical, more of the creative, and there's room for everybody there. And that's what we have to understand. There's room for everybody there. The things that have changed us and should have made us come around so much now is COVID-19. With the COVID virus, things will change. They will have no choice but to change. I was talking to someone, we were talking about face masks, and she was talking about the characteristics, and she didn't, this and that and other. And she said, I just hate this. And I looked at her, I said, no. This is an opportunity for change. All I have to do is think of a way to do this face mask that helps everybody breathe and keeps everybody pretty. And I have made some money. I just came upon something. Now I have to realize that if this is over in 3 years, I'm going out of business because nobody will need the face mask anymore unless we make it a fashion statement. Okay. So, everything that is happening now is causing, there's a need, it's causing new incentives. It's causing those creative people to begin to start thinking in many ways. I have so many ideas about what I want. I just have no idea about how to do it. Of course, I always give the example of the self-cleaning bathtub. Nobody's invented it yet. So I'm still trying to come across the self-cleaning bathtub. And every time I say it, somebody says, oh, you just have to spray. No. Self-cleaning means I just come in and flip a switch and it cleans itself. Maybe I can rinse it out, but that's it. So that's all I'm saying is that, it is a time to rethink through all the things that actually lend itself to the definition of environmental justice, environmental inequality, and that when we design things, let us make sure that we're designing things that are equitable and it fits into our vision, because we have talked about, we talk about density. We talk about density, but then we talk about green space. Now, what do you want? You want density, you want green space, because you can't have 100 people sitting on top of each other and have a third of an acre over here and say, oh, that's the green space. So this is all I'm saying. We just have to look at it. We have to think about it. And we talk about raising wealth for people, but yet we're talking about, a whole bunch of apartments. Well, the wealth goes to who? The developer? Yes. The owner? Yes. And the people renting still don't own anything. So I think that I've come to the conclusion. I had a lot of things to say, but you said a lot of them yourself when you were talking about the things, especially on the land code, and we won't get into that anymore because that is something that is ongoing, and I think there's something that we should be reporting out on shortly. So
Yeah,
thank you.
I mean, I just, taking some notes through there, yeah, I have to agree. We're coming to a point where those design decisions, we have a legacy that's made from design decisions that were about our community that were made by really, powerful white men. We need design decisions that are made by our entire community and serve our entire community, and that's a really important place, I think, for this conversation to be going. And your statements of how, it was interesting, it took a long time for us to get here. We need to be looking out to the future, too, to see where we're going with the decisions that we make now, making those intentional decisions that will not only be not racist, but intentionally address the current racism and being proactive with those. It's not enough to just not do bad. We need to do good going forward. And I think that's a really powerful perspective. I wanted to ask you one other question, and then we'll let you go for the evening. We have your evening. But the West Jefferson County Community Task Force has been going strong for a number of years. And I just wondered, what do you think are one or two of those key ingredients that has kept the task force going through, a really big project with STAR, and that was a huge issue and all that momentum. But since then, you've also been really involved in brownfields and redevelopment discussions and community health questions for West Jefferson, and you're still going. What do you think is a kind of a key to the fact that organization is still so important?
Because we address the issues that people bring to us. We don't try to handle everything. When somebody comes to us and talks about, for example, 5G, and we dealt with that because someone brought it to our attention. We went to Verizon. We actually talked about it. Of course, they didn't agree that it was doing any harm, but then again, so did the companies say exactly the same thing. There was no harm. And I'm sure that somewhere down the road, we will find there is some amount of harm. Maybe it's minimal, let's hope. But that was an issue that we dealt with. There were many people that told me, Arnita, do not deal with that. And I told them, I'm the wrong person to tell not to deal with something. But that was a big issue, that was brought to me. People were concerned about that. And they were concerned that it caused that the companies themselves could actually control it to where they could increase the output of it, which, if you read enough of it, you'll begin to realize, well, maybe there is something to this, because there are some cities in the United States and in the world that have said, you're not going to bring that here because of that concern. You have to show us a little bit more about it. So that was a concern that we handled for a little while. In fact, I still get different questions, and then I go research, just like our mission says. I research, I get the information, and I send it. I send it back to them. So just like the people, I can't think of the name of that Elliott Apartments. They brought to us the concern about the Elliott Park. They said, the Elliott Park is not neat. We just want to know what's over there. So we did some testing and soil testing. What we did, we found very high levels of lead, especially in where the children played in the same their horseshoes. So once we did that, what we did was we contacted the Parks Department, and they pushed back a little bit, but they came, cleaned up the park, resanded, the pits, and so we addressed that issue. The issue about the parks, of course, there's a big project going now, and we don't want to revisit and don't want to get in the way of the new projects that are going on in Chickasaw Park. But originally, in the early days, there was some testing there that showed that the fish, had some dioxins in their, in the fatty tissue, and they were not supposed to eat it. And sometimes this is a matter of not only educating the the community, getting something done, but it's an education and information thing that says, just ask a little bit, and we just may be able to find out some things, that are important. Just like, with the Black League, we're, trying to get there, my goal before I retire. I guess I may never retire. But, it's to see that that place developed into something that is really great for that area, for the neighborhood, that brings jobs, because that is a huge site that was cleaned up, and it was cleaned up at the expense of the people, of the polluters who made it there in the first place. Now, everything is still up in the air. They're still doing some final cleanup. So those are the things and we just can't stick to those projects. We don't just abandon them. We just don't address them, but we kind of stick with them. So many times it doesn't look like we're doing a lot, but we try to be very thorough and we try to work through it. Just like with the health, as soon as I saw from the Harvard University professor that said that COVID-19 affected people much more who lived in close proximity to polluters, 15% more deaths. Immediately that caught my attention. I'm still working on that. Oh, you haven't heard the last of that. But, at least, what we did was we brought people together that had the COVID. We talked about the COVID. And now, we're getting ready to get more information and how we can deal with that. That means that's bringing about the desire now, which is coming to us, is that we need to lower the emissions. If the emissions have something to do with the death of COVID, then they may have something to do with the death of people. So that's the reason why I'm trying to kind of begin to push this talk about looking at re-incentivizing, saying that, if in the event that you do this, okay, that's fine. It's not fine for real, because now you're going to pay for it. So that usually incentivizes anyone to begin to realize that I need to do something. And I don't want to blame the companies. Are companies. They do what they do. They do what they're supposed to do. But when what you do is affecting many people, thousands of people, then you have to look at it. It's like wearing the mask. The mask, a lot of people say, well, it's for the other person. But see, I say it's for me. That's my selfish way of thinking. It is for me. Because if you have it and you're not wearing a mask, and I am wearing a mask, who am I protecting? Not you. I'm protecting me. That's just Arnita's version. So, don't take it as the professional version. But at any rate, that's how we have continued over the years. We deal with issues that are very personal and upfront to people.
Well, I think that's a great point to wrap up on, that listening to the community concerns and sticking with the issues. That's, I think, a good lesson for government as well, and we need to do that. I'll just say I appreciate, personally and on behalf of APCD, how open West Jefferson County Community Task Force has been with bringing questions to the district and giving us an opportunity to bring information and answer those questions and to be a part of that dialogue with you all. So we'll just hope to continue to be that resource for you, and to be ready to listen and learn. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Arnita. And say thank you to my fellow presenters, Rachel and Byron, who technology kicked him off, but I know he's still here with us, actually. So we'll thank him for all those great maps throughout as well. And just hope everybody has a nice evening, and appreciate the time that was spent today talking about this really important topic. So thank you all.
Thank you.